In a previous episode looking at British tanks that still need adding to War Thunder, we took a look at the Cruiser Tank Mark 1 A9, the Covenanter tank, and a fan favourite, the TOG 2. However, there are still a large number of British tanks that still need adding to War Thunder, from unique conversions and interesting prototype designs to some of the most produced tanks used by Britain in World War II. So today we will take a look at some of these tanks, their stats, their history, and why I think they should be included in War Thunder. The first British tank we will be looking at is the A20 heavy tank, a predecessor to the A22 Churchill infantry tank. It is also sometimes bizarrely referred to as the A20 Char de Fortress, a somewhat French-sounding term, while also sometimes more sensibly called the A20 Shelled Area Tank, which gives some clues as to what sort of battlefield its designers were envisioning it to be used on. The design for the A20 came about in September 1939, and it originally was designed for battlefields that much more resembled that of World War I, being envisioned as needing to traverse shell-filled battlefields and cross trenches. This led to its original requirements of having its armament mounted on the side of the tank in sponsons and not having a turret in order to carry an unditching beam. These requirements were quickly dropped and a much more modern design with a Matilda turret was produced, though it retained a ditching tower at the rear of the tank to aid in crossing trenches. The prototype was constructed by Harland and Wolff, who were also constructing Matilda tanks at the time, and as a shipbuilding firm were already somewhat familiar with large vehicles, including constructing a certain ship I'm almost certain you've all heard of, the Titanic. The main armament was to consist of a slightly less Titanic armament of one 2-pounder 40mm gun in the Matilda turret, while a second weapon was to be mounted at the front of the tank, between the driver and another crew member. There was much debate on what this weapon was to be, with the 3 and 3.7 inch howitzers, a shortened 57mm 6-pounder, and the French short 75mm howitzer as fitted on the Char B1 bis, all being considered and rejected. Eventually the 40mm 2-pounder gun was chosen to be fitted in this frontal position, with a traverse of 7.5 degrees horizontally in either direction, though it is doubtful if this weapon was ever actually fitted. In addition to this armament, the Matilda turret would carry its standard 7.92mm coaxial machine gun, while 2 additional 7.92mm machine guns were to be placed on each side of the tank and were capable of traversing up to 90 degrees away from the tank, giving a good arc of fire. Armour was to be a maximum of 60mm thickness at the whole front, while the Matilda turret would retain its 75mm all-round thickness. I haven't found a figure for the side or rear armour, but no doubt these would be thinner than 60mm. Unfortunately, the armour does little to protect the tracks, which are completely uncovered and make a pretty big target, especially since they go around the whole of the tank, again reminiscent of World War I era tanks. It should also be pointed out that when built, the initial prototype was made of unarmoured steel, though if added to War Thunder it would of course use armour steel. The mobility of the A20 was a bit of a mixed bag, as on one hand it had been designed for crossing shell-cratered battlefields, obstacles and crossing trenches, so would have had a pretty good off-road mobility and obstacle clearing capabilities. On the other hand, it was a 40-ton tank that was powered by a Bedford twin-six engine, so called because it consisted of 2 6-cylinder engines stuck together. These engines were supposedly in fact lorry engines, though as the twin-six was capable of producing 350 horsepower, while the single engines combined would equal less than half of this, I'm not so sure if this is actually the case. The end result was that the A20 was quite a slow tank, probably not much faster than 10 miles per hour or 16 kilometers an hour, so traversing the map in this tank would be quite painful for players. Lastly, the crew complement of the A20 was to be 7 men, presumably consisting of a driver, gunner and presumably 2 machine gunners situated in the hull, with a further gunner, loader and commander in the turret. Eventually, in the summer of 1940, one of 2 prototypes of the A20 that were constructed would be sent from Harland and Wolff in Belfast to Vauxhall Motors in Bedfordshire, where its large size immediately showed how impractical it was, with the turret having to be left behind as its height exceeded that the British railways could handle. while the Royal Engineers stated that they had no bridges capable of supporting the weight of such a tank. The killing blow, however, came from the Battle of France, where feared battles of attrition over World War I style battlefields never occurred, with mobile warfare instead being the decisive factor. With the A-20's role now rendered obsolete, it was cancelled and work begun on the A-22, which would become the Churchill tank. However, when designing the engine, Vauxhall, who had no tank building experience up to this point, must have really impressed someone, as they were put in charge of designing the new tank instead of Harland & Wolff, or really any other firm that was actually experienced in tank design. Meanwhile, the A-20 prototype would end its life as simple ballast for the testing of a 70-ton tank transporter. However, some aspects of the A-20 inspired the later A-22, as the two tanks do look very similar and share many features. So how would the A-20 heavy tank fit into War Thunder? It would no doubt be an event or premium vehicle, as only two were ever built, and not even fitted out fully, and I would suggest adding it at a battle rating of 2.0 to 2.3, mainly on account of its thick armour, though its armament of two 40mm guns will also make it pretty deadly to enemy tanks. Overall, I think this would be a fun tank, and would be more of a modern super heavy meme tank for Britain over the Independent, with its only major disadvantage being its large size and more importantly its slow speed, which could of course put some players off, but even with this disadvantage I think this could be a rather successful tank in War Thunder, and a very unique tank for the British tech tree as a whole. Now, in order to discuss the next British tank, the Churchill NA-75, we need to take a look at the Churchill variant it was based on, the Churchill Mark IV, which was also the most widely produced Churchill tank variant of World War II, with around 1,622 being built. There isn't actually that much difference between the Mark IV and Mark III already in game, with the big difference being that the turret is now of cast construction instead of welded. The reason for this change is that the armour plate needed for the turret of course needed to be suitable for welding, and also needed to not flake or spool when hit by projectiles. Unfortunately, the British Bulletproof Technical Committee, who were in charge of acquiring said armour, warned that there would not be enough to continue producing welded turrets for the Churchill tank. This meant that an alternative cast turret would need to be used instead, something which had been suggested and rejected previously, mainly on account of it weighing more than a welded turret. By now, however, British casting techniques had improved, so the new turret only weighed half a ton more than the welded turret. Supposedly, casting techniques had also improved sufficiently that cast armour was now equal to RHA armour, albeit at the cost of weight. Now, of course, this probably won't apply in War Thunder because, as some of you may already know, cast armour is disadvantaged versus RHA armour in-game, as the cast armour has a 0.94 multiplier. So while the Churchill Mark III's frontal turret armour is 89mm and thus provides 89mm of protection, on the cast Churchill Mark IV turret, 89mm of armour would only provide 83.6mm of protection. Not a huge difference, but it could make a difference in a few edge cases. Lastly, with regards to armour, a few sources do mention applique armour being welded to the whole side, though these have only been brief mentions without actually giving any details, so I cannot ascertain how much difference this would actually make. Interestingly, in addition to the new turret, a new 57mm gun was also fitted, the Mark V, which had a longer barrel than the previous 57mm Mark III, the 57mm Mark V being a length 50 barrel versus the 57mm Mark III's length 43. In real life, the Churchill Mark III was fitted with the Mark III 57mm gun, giving slightly worse performance than the Mark V, with the Mark III 57mm gun having an in-game penetration of 101mm at 500 meters with APC-BC shells, but in-game it is fitted with the Mark V 57mm gun, which has a penetration of 110mm at 500 meters with APC-BC shells. Mobility should be affected slightly on account of the weight increase, but the reduction in top speed seems to have been so small that most sources state that they basically had the same top speed, so there shouldn't really be much difference here. Everything else about the tank should be the same as on the Churchill Mark III, retaining the same crew complement of a driver and machine gunner in the hull, with the gunner, loader and commander in the turret. In War Thunder, the Churchill Mark IV would most likely behave almost the same as the Churchill Mark III, so would remain at the same battle rating. With regards to tech tree placement, I would suggest foldering it with the Mark III, as well as removing the Mark III's current Mark V 57mm gun and replacing it with the Mark III 57mm gun, which would also help contrast the two tanks. Overall, the Churchill Mark IV would help bolster out the British tech tree, and although it may not play radically differently from the Mark III, as the most produced variant of the Churchill tank, I feel it deserves to have its own place in War Thunder and the British tank tech tree in general. Now that you're familiar with the Churchill Mark IV, we can take a look at the Churchill NA-75, a rather unique variant of the Churchill tank that was primarily converted from Churchill Mark IVs. The NA-75 came about from a need for a more effective dual-purpose gun. The 57mm 6-pounder gun, while an excellent anti-tank weapon, suffered when used in the anti-infantry role. Work was being done on mounting a 75mm dual-purpose weapon on British tanks, which would later become the quick-firing 75mm, but for the time being, the 75mm armed Sherman tank was the best alternative. The ability to mount a dual-purpose weapon was so important that while fighting in Italy in 1943, despite Churchill tanks having good armour, great hill climbing capabilities, and 6 Churchill tank regiments stationed in Tunisia and available for use in the fighting, these Churchill tanks were instead kept in North Africa in favour of Sherman tanks and their more appropriate 75mm guns. One officer who was looking for a way for the Churchill tanks to regain their usefulness was Captain Percy Morrell, who was second in command of the 665th Tank Troop Workshops at Le Croube in Tunisia. While serving in this role, he came up with the idea of finding a way to mount the Sherman's 75mm gun onto the Churchill Mark IV, giving it a much better all-round gun. A second minor advantage to this was that by fitting the Sherman's 75mm gun and its external mantlet, it would remove a flaw in the Churchill's recessed mantlet, where in bright sunlight a visible shadow would form in the recessed mantlet, giving a clear indicator for where German gunners should aim, where even non-penetrating shots could jam the gun or render it otherwise inoperable. Personally, I'm not sure how big this flaw actually was, as with the mantlet being in the centre of the turret, it would seem a logical place to aim regardless. And of course this wasn't changed for later Churchill and Cromwell tanks, though of course the Sherman's curved mantlet would still solve this issue while providing good protection and helping to potentially bounce incoming shots due to being more curved than the previously recessed flat mantlet. As an officer of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, or REME, he was able to bring his ideas to the attention of his superiors, and he was given permission to carry out work on fitting the Sherman's 75mm guns to Churchill Mark IVs, thereby creating the Churchill NA-75, with NA being short for North Africa, which is where they were converted. The new Sherman 75mm armed Churchill would have a penetration of 90mm at 500 metres with APC-BC shells which contained explosive filler, compared to the quick-firing 75mm guns 89mm at 500 metres with APC-BC shells without explosive filler. However, this would be inferior to the 57mm Mark V 6-pounder gun, which at 500 metres has 110mm of penetration with APC-BC shells, though again without explosive filler. As well as changing the main armament, the coaxial and bow machine guns were replaced with US Browning 30 cal machine guns in order to simplify logistics, though the coaxial machine gun couldn't elevate as far as the main armament, which could be a bit of a flaw if being used in an anti-air role. Armour should remain the same as the regular Churchill Mark IV, with the exception of the new mantlet, which would be around 76mm to 51mm thick, thinner than the Churchill tank's mantlet but also more curved, thereby helping to deflect shots. Mobility and crew complement will remain the same as the regular Churchill Mark IV, with a top speed of around 27 km an hour or 17 miles per hour, and a crew complement of 5, consisting of a driver and machine gunner in the hull, and a gunner, loader and commander in the turret. Ultimately, 210 Churchill NA-75s would be converted, and they would be sent to Italy from April 1944, where they seem to have been very successful. Even when Churchills with British 75mm guns arrived, the NA-75 variant seems to have performed much better. For his part in coming up with the idea and carrying out the conversion of these tanks, Captain Morrell would be promoted to Major and would be awarded an MBE. As for how the NA-75 would fit into War Thunder, I think the NA-75 could be added at a battle rating of around 3.7 to 4.0, either between the Churchill Mark 1 and Mark 3, or the Churchill Mark 3 and Mark 8. As while the 75mm gun would be inferior to the 57mm 6-pounder, it could still manage somewhat better at this battle rating, while the Churchill's heavy armour will still keep it protected, which is also the main reason I would hesitate to put it at a lower battle rating. Overall, I think this could be a rather unique British tank, combining the already good Churchill with a slightly better 75mm weapon than the British quick-firing 75mm gun, as well as carrying improved shells and a potentially improved mantlet, while also being a rather cool example of improvisation during World War II, and just in general a cool tank to use, and I would love to see it added to War Thunder. So, having looked at these 3 tanks, I would be interested to hear your opinions on which of these tanks you would like to see added to War Thunder first. For me personally, I would like to see the NA-75 added first, as it will be a much more practical tank for use in War Thunder, as well as having a much better APC-BC shell than on the existing British 75mm gun. That said, I would also love to use the A-20, as I just can't resist playing a huge tank that, while impractical in real life, could be a lot of fun in game. I would also like to hear your suggestions for other British tanks you would like me to cover, as there are still many British tanks that still need adding to War Thunder, so there will no doubt be a future video covering these. So that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it and will join me for future episodes covering British tanks. I've been Tyranno, and I'll see you next time.